name is Joseph Carlson, and this is episode 26 of The Grief of Politics. I'm joined once again by Avin Carroll. Avin, how you doing?
I am doing good. How are you today, sir?
Good. We had some false starts and stuff, and I'm trying to set up a new thing, so I look at the camera. So I apologize if my island looks over here because the monitors are over here, so I might catch a glance of Avin's face. Yeah, this was Avin's choice this month, and we're going to talk about the Second Amendment, a nice breezy topic that'll just make your Sunday or whenever, this post Monday, I think it'll just make your Monday feel so much lighter, I'm sure. Avin, why did you choose this? I'm just asking what was not like, how dare you, but like, what was your,
so I'd seen some recent news, just talking about, recent Supreme Court decision on the Second Amendment, and then talking about how that's going to impact upcoming cases. As you know from reading through the articles, there's several pretty important upcoming pending cases on gun rights laws and what's going to happen with those, and very much directly impacted by the decision last year about this time that really kind of reshaped how every gun restriction law, gun freedom law is passed on the books.
Yeah, the one that I took, not a lot of notes, but some notes, the one that hasn't been decided yet, I think that's a big deal, the one in New York. I think that's the one that's going to be big. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely always in the news, unfortunately. Being an American, you always read about some gun violence, Second Amendment rights. The debate continues, with, I think, gun owners, saying, you can't, this is what we think. And then I will get into that in the articles. When reading these articles, what was your kind of big takeaway though, when you read over them? I mean, was it what you expected, or did you read? Because some of this was actually very surprising to me when I read over
it. I actually wasn't familiar with the most recent kind of big decision that they made last year. I believe it was Bruen. Might be mispronouncing it, but I wasn't familiar with the precedent that was actually set by that.
Yeah, that's the New York case, right?
That's the New York case that was decided last year. There's another new pending New York case that will have an impact on, of course, laws as well. But the big one that was decided last year was New York State Rifle and Pistol Association, Inc. versus Bruen. And the big impact of that one was the precedent that was set by it. If I read it correctly, essentially what they said in that was that any gun law that is passed has to also meet with traditional historical precedent, which essentially just means it needs to line up with gun rules and restrictions from 1791, or at least that's how it's being treated.
Right. There's another article actually that we'll bring in later that actually talks about that, which I thought was really interesting. And I'm going to read passages where I was like, haha. But we'll get there. It's like you had a lot of articles, so this took a while to put this together.
And they're meaty, right? Like, this is a really heavy and nuanced topic. And so, yeah, there's a lot of stuff in these.
Yeah, the one thing that bothers me about this, just the listing from the USLA, WShield.com, the legal defense for self-defense, and they've listed the Supreme Court cases. There's just a part of my eye that twitches because they go all over the place with years. And you'd think if you were formatting something, you go from oldest to newest. But I don't know how they felt. Maybe it was the implications of the case, or I don't know. It was just weird reading it because I was like, well, this all seems to matter, and it's out of order. Like you mentioned, maybe you don't care about something that happened in 1875 is one of the cases here, but 1886, 1939, all this stuff does matter. But it was weird, just the formatting of okay, we're in 86, and now we're in 1939, and now we're in 2016. It was like, what the heck? So.
I think really they're trying to line up the cases that kind of stack on top of each other. Like, how does one set a precedent for the next? as opposed to looking at it chronologically, they're looking for like, how is the foundation built? How is the next level built up off of that to get us to where we are today?
Right. So I guess we just start with, basically I just, my initial impressions were what I said. This was actually incredibly informative, and it actually kind of like changed, I'm a gun owner, but it changed because you always hear this thing about, obviously the Second Amendment and states' rights. And it's like, well, why don't they just have a national ban if it's that? But you start reading this, and the Supreme Court specifically says why there isn't a national ban on firearms, basically, in all these rulings. And the one I picked out was the United States versus Lopez is one of them. It's from 1995. It's like middle of the thing. Basically, I'm just going to read this. Alphonse Lopez Jr. was convicted of violating the Gun-Free School Zones Act of 1990 after bringing a revolver that was unloaded and cartridges, which if it's a revolver anyway, it should be anyway, and cartridges to his Texas high school. Lopez argued that regulating or banning guns in local schools was well outside the power of Congress under the Commerce Clause and was unconstitutional. But this is what I thought was interesting. But the federal government argued that bringing a gun to school would cause more gun violence and crime, which would lead to economic problems. The ruling, this case was actually a major Commerce Clause case, but it is in this list of Second Amendment Supreme Court cases because the SCOTUS ruled the Gun-Free Zone Acts of 1990 was unconstitutional. They further limited how the federal government could regulate or restrict gun rights. So what keeps coming up in these cases, which I think is interesting, is that although the Second Amendment applies to the U.S. government, so it does not apply to states. So states still have the right to regulate gun ownership how they feel, whatever, through legislation and things like that. And so I always think that's interesting of like, and then how does Congress pass like national regulations on gun ownership? And to me, that was very kind of informative. Like, yeah, that makes sense. States' rights, all this kind of stuff. So, but I do think the last two lines, but the federal government argued that bringing a gun to school would cause more gun violence and crime, which would lead to economic problems, which I think is underselling the loss of life. I mean, this is the grief of politics. There will be economic problems, but also if guns go to school and it will lead to more violence and crime, that will probably be the loss of life, which is obviously the most important thing, I think.
Well, and right. I mean, for this conversation, that's probably where the biggest amount of grief comes in, right? And that's why I added an extra article. I'd done a lot of reading, and all of it was kind of centered around the Bruen decision and how it was impacting how laws were being passed and how tests of those laws were coming forward into federal court. But none of them were really talking about why we have an argument, right? Like if you just read those, it'd be like, okay, well, like what's the big deal? Why are we writing these laws? Why don't we just not write them? Of course, everyone that lives in the United States knows. There's a lot of gun violence in the United States. We are a very pro-gun country. One of the articles points out, as far as like the Western countries of the world, most of the developed countries in the world, private gun ownership is completely outlawed or extremely restricted. Right. And in the United States, it's like, even though NRA and pro-gun organizations would say like, oh, we're way too heavily restricted, compared to the rest of the world, there's basically none. Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing too, is I think the one thing that I keep reading about is, the NRA, which we'll bring into later. It's a later article, but the fact that they are advocating supposedly for gun owners, but I mean, a lot has been written about the NRA and the fact that they are somewhat, I mean, if not all, lobbyists, right? Like the gun manufacturers donate to them. And so it is within their best interest to talk about, if you're getting a donation from a firearms manufacturer, it's within your best interest to promote firearms. I mean, plain and simple. I'm not saying any moral judgment of, is that good or bad? But like, if a company is giving you money, there's a reason why they're giving you that money. The other one I actually wanted to bring up was the District of Columbia versus Heller. Mm-hmm. So I'm using an iPad to scroll through. It's actually kind of nice doing this. District of Columbia versus Heller. And I think this is interesting because this is actually a point by point thing of the problem. The problem, Special Policeman Dick Heller and several other residents of the District of Columbia all wanted a gun for self-defense. At the time, this was in 2008. At the time, DC prohibited carrying of any unregistered firearms, yet bar all handgun registration, which is weird. DC also required all lawful owned guns to be kept unloaded and disassembled or bound by a trigger lock, including in a person's own home, with few exceptions. Heller felt this ban prevented someone from properly defending themselves at home and violated the Second Amendment. This is why I think it's interesting, because the ruling really is a point-by-point thing, so I want to read this. In the Second Amendment Supreme Court case, the court made several rulings upholding our constitutional right to keep and bear arms. It found that the Second Amendment protects an individual right to own firearms for the purpose of self-defense unrelated to militia or military activity. And because handguns are today's primary defense weapon of choice, they're also protected. The phrase bear arms meant to wear, bear, or carry upon the persons or in clothing or in a pocket for the purpose of being armed and ready for offensive or defensive action in the case of conflict with another person. 3, a well-regulated militia is not the state's militia forces. So that's interesting. The DC regulation effectively banning handgun possession and the law required firearms in the home to be kept inoperable at all times, both violating Second Amendment protections. And 5, the Second Amendment is not unlimited or absolute. Reasonable restrictions may be upheld, such as the limits of firearm possession, carrying in schools and government buildings, and dangerous and unusual weapons. Unfortunately, the District of Columbia is under the exclusive jurisdiction of Congress and the federal government, not a state, right? There's been talk of DC becoming the 51st state. So while SCOTUS made several key decisions on what the Second Amendment means and protects, the case shed no light on whether states could regulate and or ban firearms. So I thought that was interesting. What I think is interesting is they're really carving out like, hey, there's the government still, especially with the schools, in federal buildings, you're not allowed to carry firearms. In schools, there's a federal ban because I'm sure of the funding that the feds give to schools. They're like, no, this is also protected type thing. Like all that was really interesting to me. Like I thought that was really good. And there's one more. In 2016, there was a stun gun. One with stun guns, which I thought was interesting. Which goes into like I think later. Right here. Cantino versus Massachusetts in 2016. I thought this was interesting because this will come up in an article later. The problem, Jamie Cantino was charged with owning an illegal weapon after displaying a stun gun during a dangerous encounter with her abusive ex-boyfriend in Massachusetts. The Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court upheld the state prohibition on stun gun possession, stating stun guns weren't protected by the Second Amendment because they weren't, quote, number one, not in common use at the time. So because the stun guns were not available during 1770, whatever, they're not, common use at the time. 2, dangerous and unusual as a modern invention. And 3, couldn't be easily adapted for military use, which seems odd. I will say this, though. The Second Amendment Supreme Court case is often left off most lists because it doesn't impact any gray areas. When SCOTUS took the case, the facts were so clear that they were able to issue a per curiam decision issued by the court rather than a specific justice without even having to hear oral arguments. To put it in perspective, from 1946 to 2012, SCOTUS has issued a per curiam decision in only 7% of cases. The court made it clear the SJC's reasoning for upholding the Massachusetts law violated the Second Amendment based on both the decision in Heller and McDonald. They repeated that the Second Amendment protects weapons for self-defense purposes and not just for military reasons, and it applies to weapons that were not in existence at the time of a founding. SCOTUS also clarified the simple being of modern invention did not make it dangerous and unusual. Justice Samuel Alito, joined by Justice Clarence Thomas, in a concurring opinion, also scolded Massachusetts for failing to protect its citizens from others who were dangerous, reminding us that the Second Amendment protects our right to defend our lives when the states are, quote, are unable or unwilling to do so, end quote. If the fundamental right of self-defense does not protect Cantino, then the safety of all Americans is left to the mercy of state authorities who may be more concerned about disarming the people than keeping them safe. So what I think is interesting about this, and we'll get into an article later, is that it talks about what was modern at the time and what was acceptable at the time. And then too, the object of self-defense. I think there's 2 articles that touch on people that have been subject of domestic abuse that were not able to have a fire, like the alleged perpetrator of the domestic abuse, I think had a gun in an article we're going to read. So if they've been charged with a felony, they're not allowed, or they have a restraining order, they're not allowed to have a firearm, and they did. And then 2, someone protecting themselves, in this case, sounds like was allowed, but there's other cases where they're not allowed to have a firearm. We'll read that later. But I don't know what article you want to go to next. But one of the things in the articles we'll talk about later talks about history and the Supreme Court, which is opened my brain up to a fascinating thing, and I want to read more about, that I hope somebody wrote an article about it or something, or a book, because it was like a paragraph in that article that just like blew my mind. So I don't know. I've been talking a lot. Do you have anything to add?
You know, as far as the court cases go, right? Like, I think they set a really good foundation for where we're going. And particularly with the most recent decision, talking about that Caetano versus Massachusetts, I think is really important, because it kind of ties into and relates to the Bruen decision.
Right.
I mean, the Bruen decision doesn't talk about that directly, or at least not in what I was reading about it. But it's important to recognize that they kind of exist independent of each other. So, if we're going to go and start reading into the articles and not just sort of the case law history behind.
I just wanted to set up. I mean, that was a good resource, because it. Yeah. I hear about that all the time, about like, oh, like these cases are fascinating and just read them. But like, these decisions are sometimes hundreds of pages long, and to just have somebody to break it down of like, this is what it was, this is what the case was, here's what the problem was, and here's the ruling. No matter how I feel about the ruling, like it's kind of like, oh, okay, so these are the bullet points that the court found was the reason for this. And I was like, wow, I hope I don't know if there's more websites that don't just do Second Amendment stuff, but like any amendment stuff of like, let's break this down. And, that's, I think, why we like the Britannica Procon so much.
So just so people know, this was from uslawshield.com. The title of the article is Key Second Amendment Supreme Court Cases.
Yeah, I'll link it in the YouTube, whatever, so people can click on it.
And then
source.
Joe will link it in the description.
Yeah.
So you can go look this up. So it's a good resource to have, understanding the various case law around Second Amendment, at least key cases.
Right.
So next article is from USA Today.
Oh, I clicked on the wrong one. That's all right. I'll get it.
It was published just this week, February 15th, 23. And it's talking about gun rights, because this is right after the Michigan State shooting happened.
Do you remember? So the Michigan State thing, I just read the headline. Was it 5 people were killed and 2 were injured? Do you know off the top of your?
Oh, I don't know what the final numbers were. I only saw the headlines as it was coming out.
That's, if you're not American and you're listening to this, that's what we are. That's where we're at in this debate is, oh man, this one I don't really know, because it just keeps happening. So I don't really know.
Well, it's pretty new, one, and two, I didn't pick this discussion because of that particular topic.
Right.
Right. Like we chose this a month ago, and so that wasn't where I was reading.
Right.
But as I was looking up articles, this one had just popped up, and I thought it would be the way they talk about the Bruen decision and how it impacts things. I thought was very important.
Yeah.
So, what they're talking about here is the headline is, "As Nation Reels from Michigan State Shooting, Courts Wrestle with Access to Guns," written by John Fritz. Again, February 15th, 23. And they talk about how we're nationally, how we're working through kind of these cases, and what does this one mean for it. They talk about a series of criminal cases percolating in lower federal courts are striking at a question about when the government may deny someone access to a gun. And they're specifically working around people with criminal backgrounds and what that means. Like, can we restrict it? Can we not? Are we violating their rights when we do? What denotes someone that should have that right taken away? Specifically, people that are nonviolent felons.
Right.
And so there's kind of this argument going back and forth. They have a bullet point lower down in the article, and others talked about this too, that the power of the Bruen decision, in that you have to have traditional and historical precedent to set a law. That's they say, quote, "Some lower courts are now tossing gun laws that don't have historical roots. Some of the cases will likely wind up at the Supreme Court." And the reason that they're doing that is because essentially the Supreme Court has said if it doesn't have historical roots, it doesn't matter what your law is. It doesn't. It's not constitutional.
So I have a question for you with a historical. I mean, obviously they're looking at old case law, saying, how does this affect? They look for precedent, right? But I mean, with the past few years, I mean, in my opinion, there is precedent being set now. Maybe it isn't going to court, but like we're seeing more of these things on the news. So like, I mean, we're not lawyers and we can't really speak to this, but how do you, when you say historical precedent, but then there's nothing on the books to say like, hey, this is a problem now, what do we do? Like, what do you look back to? And I think that they actually talk about that in an article later, but I don't know. It seems to me that this stuff that is historical is strange, especially with the Supreme Court. And people have been talking about it with tons of different cases where the Supreme Court will pull something from 1800 and say, this is why we're ruling. They did it with Roe v. Wade, of like, they pulled a law from like the 1800s saying, this is why we think this way. And it's like, man, it's 2023. You know what I mean? Like, why go back that? Well, it's because that's what the law was. But like, anyway, it's we're not lawyers, but I find it fascinating. It's just kind of like piecemeal picking from history, where it's like, well, where is your thought process? Because that was a long time ago. You know what I mean? Even these cases they're citing from like 1939, that was like almost 100 years ago, right? So it's like, what? Like, what? Like, I don't know. I think that's what I'm finding fascinating about all this, is like how it must really be difficult for the defense in like these cases where they're trying to advocate for like victims to be like, well, we don't have like something on the books to look back to. We can only go back to like 1929 or whatever, which is infuriating because it's like, what about all this stuff that's happening now? And I think for the grief aspect, that's what I've been finding fascinating, is reading the correlation between history and the Supreme Court and how they pull from history.
And how so in the grief perspective that how they're pulling from history?
Well, because, I mean, to go to I'll just do it right now. Cause if somebody wrote a book on this subject, I keep having to go back to your thing. It's the CBS News article. Nope, not that one. Not the one that it keeps doing that. Not
in wake
the
of
new
Supreme Court Second Amendment decision, uncertainty plagues gun laws, new and old.
Yeah, is this the? Yes, okay. So this is the quote that I got a pop-up ad right in the middle of the article. Cool. Get out of here. Get out. Okay. The laws. This is from. Sorry. Yeah, you just read the title. The laws. Quote, the laws, those recently enacted in states, as well as longstanding federal restrictions with broad support, are being tested in courtrooms from coast to coast, where judges are tasked with evaluating whether they are consistent with the nation's historical tradition of firearm regulation. And they talk about the Bruen case. We're seeing a lot of action and a lot of unpredictability when it comes to the Second Amendment after Bruen, said Joseph Blocher, co-director of Duke University Center for Firearms Laws. It's happening in a bunch of different directions, and the source of the change is a new methodology that the Supreme Court announced in the Bruen case because it instructs the courts to evaluate the constitutionality of laws based solely on whether there are, in some ill-defined sense, with historical tradition. And then the one thing I wanted to see. Oh no. Oh no. Where is it? Oh no. Oh no. I can't find my quote. Okay. No, not that one. Oh no, I can't read my writing. Oh crap.
Uh-oh.
I should have typed these out as notes and not anyway, hang on. Crap. Yeah. This was the one no, this is incredibly thrilling. I will say that I think it was this article that talked about how, man, I wish I could just find, right here. Quote, in the founding era, you won't always find laws that directly disarmed people for intimate partner violence. So like the domestic violence thing, it was something legislators concerned themselves with, but it would be absurd to say we can't do the same simply because in 1791, women were not given the same protection of the laws they deserved then and now. So yeah, that's the thing. When you look back to history and there really isn't laws in the books protecting domestic violence, that's because in 1791, they weren't as concerned with domestic violence because women just didn't have rights. They couldn't vote, right. Stuff like that. So it's like, what? Who cares, right? So, right here. Right here. This is what it was. Oh my God. Okay. I found it. I'm excited. Quote, this court is not a trained historian. The justices of the Supreme Court, distinguished as they may be, are not trained historians. We lack both the methodological and substance knowledge that historians possess, he wrote. The sifting of evidence that judges perform is different than the sifting of sources and methodologies that historians perform. And we are not experts in what white, wealthy, and male property owners thought about firearm regulations in 1791, yet we are now expected to play historians in the name of constitutional adjudication. Many of the courts fight over new state gun control laws in their early stages, and judges have been asked to block enforcement of laws while leading proceedings continue. So that kind of blew my mind reading that, which makes sense if you just stop and think about it. But the fact that, like, because you look at law and look at what is on the books, you don't look back and know what you don't read the diary entries of the founding fathers, see what they thought about things, how they thought about things, how things have changed. I mean, there's people that just like that devote their life to law, devote their life to history, and say like, this is why this is how it is. But a judge doesn't have the time to do that. So we're asking them to be historians on top of being a judge. And they're saying, they're ill-equipped to basically do this. If somebody's spending, 5 years researching a book about the founding fathers, they're putting all their time and energy to that and then publishing the book. And that may change how you look at the time back then and people back then, Yeah. So, I mean, to me, that kind of blew my mind when I read, I was like, of course, and so how is that affecting gun laws now? And it put everything kind of in perspective that, these people aren't historians, and when you hear historians talk about diary entries from what they were thinking, there's no way the founding fathers could obviously envision the world how it is. So like, how do we interpret that, and like a lot of people say, that's the problem with going back to 18, whatever, to be like, this is why,
1791.
Yeah. 1791 to say, these are your property rights. So yep. I found the quote. Okay, I can sleep now. I found the quote. I was going to wake up at 2 a.m. and scream if I couldn't.
Same article, a little bit further down, another quote comes out. This is from Sanchez Gomez. Legislators should not be taking Justice Thomas at his word and understand that Bruen, the court decision, is not a regulatory straitjacket. Doing nothing in the wake of violence out of fear it might be challenged seems like a game of negotiating with yourself at the cost of many lives. Let's talk about Bruen, understand what it means. But given that it's still in flux, it's counterproductive to be thinking too much about exactly the outer bounds.
Yeah.
So, because it's so new and because there haven't really been a lot of challenges to it yet, there haven't been a lot of cases coming around it up to the Supreme Court level for them to give more clarity on exactly what they mean in this testing methodology.
Right.
As they said earlier, it's sort of ill-defined. We're going to be in this weird flux with gun laws and what's going on and what's not.
I think what's troubling from the grief aspect of this is like, because you have to wait for precedent, like we've just talked about, and wait, like you said, wait for things to basically shake out and see what happens. How does this affect people? Many times this is people's lives. So this isn't just we painted the town a new color and we're going to see people like it. Like this, with gun violence, this affects people's very lives, So the wait and see approach can have terrible effects and after effects,
Correct. It sort of outlines one of the bigger challenges that we have in the United States. And we've talked about the Supreme Court before and kind of the challenges that we have at the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court sets precedent for our law. In the United States, we determine what the law is based off of legal precedents from pre-existing case law. And if a law isn't written explicitly clearly, which, happens all the time. But
right, because it's law. I've had to read legal briefs before that weren't, not only here, but other places. And you're like, what?
Well, and you read them and you're like, wait, this means the exact opposite of what I think it means because of the way
it's written.
The law is written. Yeah. So that's why we have lawyers who interpret and protect and defend it. So it's very challenging from a perspective of like, where do we come down? How do we land on the Second Amendment? Now, historically, it wasn't that big of a deal up until, I don't know, 30 or 40 years ago. There wasn't a ton of challenges to the Second Amendment. But
I think maybe I was talking about it with my wife, with Carla this morning, because I was like, hey, we're going to have this nice breezy episode about the Second Amendment. She goes, oh, that'll be great. And I said, we were talking about gun violence. And I said, well, I think the first wake up for citizens, I think of the U.S., or at least people watching the news, was Columbine. That was like the first big thing where you're like, what?
Yeah.
Like that happened in a school, and then after that, you've just seen that proliferate. I can't speak today. Too much coffee. Yeah, too much coffee, which I'm about to drink some more. But there's that. And then also, kids now have shooter drills in school,
Yeah. And we've seen, we had the Marysville Pilchuck shooting here.
Yeah, we did. Yep.
Actually very close to me. We've had multiple school shootings across the country. We had the shooting at Michigan State this week.
Yeah.
And so the conversation is far more public, I think, with the advent of internet and social media, publications, information, articles coming out, opinion pieces coming out are far more common. And so the discussion, I think, is more lively and vibrant than it's been before. Mm-hmm. And it really comes back to, and kind of the big reason I wanted to bring it up, right? I tend to have more conservative leaning viewpoints. And there's this challenge of, well, we need to be more restrictive versus we need to be more protective of individuals' rights.
Right.
And it develops a difficult sticky point. As a conservative person, I am a very, very vehement defender of our Second Amendment. I think it is an extremely important part about what makes American democracy work. Now, there's challenges to it. We have a lot of debate back and forth, and you and I have, and elsewhere around the United States, we really, challenge, is democracy working or not in the way that we think it is?
That was just in the news, actually. Anyway, that could be another episode. There was just
but the Second Amendment provides us, the average everyday American citizen, with the ability to be armed. And it makes the government scared of oppressing us, because that means that, we can actually fight back. Now, that was the intention of it. But at this point in time, even if we're all fully allowed to have AR-15s, AK-47s.
Some states you are. Some states,
and
after
states.
yeah.
But I mean,
if
the federal government came out and said you cannot ban any type of gun ownership, the American citizen should be allowed to own any gun that the military can own. Even if you do that, like a neighborhood militia that's resisting oppression from our federal government is going to be fighting against, Bradleys, Abrams,
it's like escalation.
F-35s, right? Like there is no way in reality that we're going to fight. I mean, even armored Humvees with small arms. We can put up a resistance if we were ever to get to that point, but we would never actually win against the United States military. So even for me, it's this difficult grappling of, well, okay, so if that's the case, where do we balance individual freedom, the ability to protect ourselves but we also have to protect anyone else in the country, their right to live, their right to health and safety, right? These aren't explicit, but sort of implied in the right to happiness. I should be able to walk down the street without being afraid that someone might shoot me.
Yeah. Well, I think actually we should probably talk about the article that talks about that. Like you did link an article on, it was from abc.news, news.go.com. And I think this was like a really good article about the link between gun violence and suicide, saying that although gun violence is bad, they had several charts, which that's how I knew that you sent the article and I didn't send it because there were several charts to back up your point. I do think all of that is fascinating. It charts sometimes make my eyes glaze over, but there was this
that is wonderful.
Yeah, I know. Well, for some people, they just say, "Hey, let me ask you a question," and then that's the whole podcast. But what I do like about this is when it balanced the suicide portion and the homicide portion. This chart halfway through gun deaths ranks by state 2019. That was really good because it's literally like a balance on a scale, and then they had another color on there, and I thought that was really good because it's like some states it's like 50-50, like gun violence. Homicide, and then it swings the other way. Is like there's more suicide by gun violence than homicide, and
by vast majority there are way more gun suicides than there are gun homicides. The what was it, like 60% of all gun deaths are suicide, I think was the actual number.
Well, what I think was fascinating too is this came up with Uvalde, which was I will say it was like one of the few times I've heard pro Second Amendment people talk about mental health seriously, because that's been something I think at least people I listen to on the left have been talking about a long time. And I think it was one of those things of, man, maybe we do really need to start talking about mental health. And a lot of this, if you have mental health treatment, outreach programs, people know that they can call a number or go somewhere or talk to somebody who's licensed in mental health, I don't know, like a screening, or they could just talk to somebody and have some kind of outreach, then, I'm sure some of these deaths could have been prevented. And it's something where, when I hear people talk about stripping budgets of that kind of stuff, of like, do we really have money for it? It's like, well, what is it worth to you in the long run? Is it worth this line item on a budget, or like there's a problem? Like we've always talked about in the podcast, people are very bad at looking down the road and future-proofing themselves, or looking to the future, saying what could be a problem. And I think this
remember where it is, but one of these articles actually even does talk about the economic costs of being over something like $1 billion a year related to gun violence.
Right.
So
is it this article or is it
that money? I think it's this article. So the one quote I wanted to read out of here too, there's a couple of really interesting things that came out of this. So it's abcnews.go.com that Joe's talking about, or will link. And it's titled, America Has a Gun Violence Problem. What do we do about it? It's from 2021. So it's a little bit older, but ABC News was basically doing like a series on gun violence. Yeah. And there was a couple of things that really stood out. One was the suicide. And looking over here, the most recent data from health officials shows that suicides account for the bulk, over 60% of gun deaths in America.
Yeah.
Another quote that they have sort of related to that is, what you don't hear about and what people don't assess is, for every story of a mass shooting, which is what we talk about and why there's a lot of discussion, a lot of passion, you're getting protests and
Mm-hmm.
a high level of
Mm-hmm.
activism related to
Mm-hmm.
gun violence because of mass shootings. For every story of a mass shooting, there are on average 300 other stories, most of them suicide, that are
Mm.
never told.
Yeah.
So access to a gun simply in and of itself is a dangerous thing. So then do you restrict that? And that gets extremely difficult.
Yeah.
You and I have talked about, I believe I've talked about it on the podcast before too. I've dealt with depression since I was a teenager, and
Yep.
sometimes it's very severe. And I personally choose not to own a gun. I enjoy shooting. I love target shooting. It's a ton of fun. I do believe in owning firearms for personal protection of the home. But I will tell you, there are times in my life where if I owned a gun, I don't know that we'd be having this conversation, because
Yeah.
simply the ease of pulling the trigger might have meant that I wouldn't have had the time gap to stop and realize I didn't want to actually kill myself.
Yeah, I mean, it's really good that you realize that, because I think some people don't get to that. They don't get to the realization part of it, of like, oh, I shouldn't own this or whatever, you know.
Mm-hmm. And then, there's the next step of that too. A lot of other gun violence that you don't read about because it doesn't fall into that mass casualty, mass shooting, which is categorized as 4 fatalities or higher.
Mm-hmm.
Home domestic violence, other crimes of passion. A lot of that happens because, again, access to a gun. Yes, a husband and or wife, girlfriend or boyfriend, other significant other may stab someone, but you're far less likely to kill a person stabbing them.
Yeah, and I mean, that's why I think there is important to push back on those laws that are, maybe
ERPOs,
not
extreme risk protection orders.
Yeah, like those, and like, because there does seem to be, like, we read the one where it was they were like, oh, they like, he can't own a firearm, and it was like, oh, that's an unconstitutional law, we need to throw that out. It's like, she's in real danger,
Mm-hmm.
The stun gun one, I think, pointed out a good thing of, wait a minute, just because they didn't think of a stun gun in like the 17 whatever, like, it's not of modern times, like, that seems wicked. Right. But at least with that case, they started talking about stun guns, so that was put into the law of like, okay, now we can start talking about stun guns. So
right.
I guess it's a silver lining.
And like, ERPOs bring up real problems because the government can really use that to just sort of blanket take guns away. As someone's filed a complaint, we're just going to take all your guns away. It doesn't actually look at the individual situation or cases, and it gets real difficult when you start getting to Second Amendment law, because we're talking about constitutional rights of an individual. That, is it constitutional to take a gun away because someone is accused of person of being at high risk without actually going through due process to determine if they really truly are at high risk?
I mean, you didn't bring it into here, but there has been studies about red flag laws, and they do kind of seem to work where someone gets flagged as being problematic. They can at least hold the sale of the gun, or the police can raid the person's home and see if they have any firearms, if they're going to do. I mean, I remember after Uvalde, I believe it was in California, there was somebody called like a tip line, and there was some kind of red flag law, and somebody was actually stopped from committing a crime.
It was a grandma calling about her grandson.
Yeah, it was like, I think it was Berkeley.
The challenge with it isn't necessarily saying that they don't work, because I mean, reality is probably in most cases they do, but they open up that door for constitutional abuse, and that starts getting real sticky, because if you open up the situation for constitutional abuse, then you also open up the situation it could be tried the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court shuts it down, and now those rules go away and those tools go away. But also, if you live in a state that tends to be real heavy-handed about gun laws, right? Like DC's law in 2008 that was shut down, it was flagrantly an attempt of DC to disarm its citizens. It was flagrant.
Right.
We're going to make it illegal to own a gun without registration, and then we're not going to provide registration.
Well, I think one thing also, just like reflecting on this after I read this morning, was thinking about it. This is a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation, because if you restrict gun laws, people that want guns will still get guns. I mean, that's what people on the pro Second Amendment gun owners will say. Listen, it's going to happen anyway. If you want to find one, where there's a will, there's a way. The people will find a gun. But I think if you open it up, then you're going to do whatever you want anyway. You're going to buy what you want. You're going to do what you want. If you have the means, that's what you're going to do. And so I really think this last article about mental health is important. Of like, we really need to start addressing root causes of why people feel that they need to, people that have some mental illness or something like that feel that they, the gun is the answer. And again, there's been studies done in red flag laws. They do work. I think, they've been shown to work even in places like Florida and things like that. And I think what dismays me, and we're getting a little bit towards the end, but I think what dismays me, and I've told this to gun owners, like my friend of mine is a gun owner. What I feel is we didn't really bring it up, but the NRA, you brought an article with the NRA, and I feel that they're really the only voice that's talking about this. And, like we just talked about at the beginning of the podcast, they are essentially a lobbying group for firearms manufacturers in a way. And so I think there needs to be legal, lawful gun owners that need to be vocal on a national stage about what is happening. Because what I'm hearing from the few podcasts and things I read is they're trying to affect state law, which is important. We've just talked about how there's a federal and state, line of like, hey, the government can't take away your guns, but like the states have to regulate your guns. I don't feel there's a national conversation from registered law-abiding gun owners. They seem to be very silent. And for me, on the left, it's kind of infuriating to allow people like the NRA and, elected officials who we all know, it doesn't matter if they're Democrat or Republican, they get donations from lobbyists. And so when they come forward and do this, it's very frustrating. I want people that are literally saying, listen, this is my hobby, and they want to protect their hobby. What can I do? Because I think that they're reading the worst parts of the left that say we need to ban all guns.
I think it goes much deeper than hobby, though, right? Like, I enjoy shooting from a hobbyist perspective, but I also definitely agree with gun ownership from a home protection, personal protection standpoint too, right? Yeah. Good guy with a gun. We don't see a whole lot of news about it, but good guy with a gun is a real thing, right? It's a narrative people talk about because it does exist. Now, maybe it's anecdotal in that when I say that it's a small percentage, but I would be interested to see if we have, I'm sure we have the data. I'd be interested to go back and look at like how often does a law-abiding citizen with a gun prevent a violent crime from happening?
Well, I mean, we do have some data on that, but again, I was talking to Frank because he owns several firearms and stuff. He's a gun owner. Yeah. He actually had a lapsed membership to the NRA because he thought too. He's like, I'm kind of disillusioned with, but I believe. But anyway, I told him I was kind of working it out in real time. I think the reason why that narrative sometimes doesn't work for gun owners is because that number that a good guy with a gun saves is always X. So like you like math and I'm terrible at math, but like you're in a crowd, you have a gun, you see a perpetrator that's going to open fire on people, you kill them, right? So like that's crisis averted. The good guy with the gun has killed one person, but when it fails or it's not there, right? But you don't know the perpetrator, how many rounds they could have fired, if the gun would have jammed, how trained they are, like all those are X factors, right? But you know that the good person with the gun killed one person. But when you have an event like Uvalde, like the mass thing, you can say, well, in Uvalde, we know 21 people were dead. Supposedly that person bought the gun legally. We know that in Massachusetts, so many people died because I don't know if that person's legal. Actually, I'm not going to say that. But, there was so many instances of like, we know this is how many people die from this. So yes, good people with guns are effective, but we will never know the true toll of that. But we know the other toll, which is people just dying through gun violence at,
But again, even there, you're citing the mass shootings, which we, reading through the article it's less than 3% of all gun fatalities in the United States are mass shooting events. Most of them are solitary, and the vast majority of them are suicide. So, even there, good guy with the gun has an issue because good guy with the gun has a really bad day, finds out his wife is leaving him, or whatever it may be, decides he's going to kill himself, right?
Yeah.
So there's that part of the argument. The thing is I think good guy with a gun narrative doesn't need to be mass shooting event. I would wager that the vast majority of situations where a private citizen, law-abiding gun owner prevents a crime is probably very frequently personal defense. And I would wager that a lot of that is women personal defense, protecting from abduction and rape. I would wager
domestic violence,
home invasion. Domestic violence gets real sticky, right? Like, you might be preventing domestic violence, you might be escalating domestic violence, but
because there's a gun in the home, something can go terribly wrong. Yeah.
So it's one of those things that's super difficult to legislate. It's very difficult to regulate because there's so many broad ramifications to it, and the way that the Constitution is written is, you have the right to keep and bear arms. And currently we're interpreting that as more heavily leaning towards the personal defense side of things, but that wasn't the actual initial intention for it. The initial intention was different.
And again, going back to the quote that I read that blew my mind, the fact that the Supreme Court justices are not historians. So back in the day when you're fighting a revolution and
He's not talking about Supreme Court justices. That was an actual individual judge at a lower court level saying that we as justices, period, are not. And this is something that we're going to have to do.
But that's my point is, when you're fighting a revolution against an oppressive government like we were during there, and then you start writing Bill of Rights amendments, what have you, Second Amendment, that is that moment in history gets changed over hundreds of years. And how do you look back on that and stuff like that? That's definitely going to color the way you look, at everything. I don't know. We almost are running out of time though. So Avin, my eyelight's been all over the place. My eyes have been like squirrels. What do you want to promote before we take off?
So of course I have my own YouTube channel, Your Agent Guide. I talk about real estate stuff. Also, you can just check out my website, youragentguide.com, all one word.
Some videos on there. Check out those.
The other thing I'd probably promote would be another podcast that I'm on occasionally. A friend of mine does. It's called Gaming with Grief. It's hosted by Joseph Carlson.
Almost episode 200. We're almost there to episode 200. Just want to let everybody know. So.
There, I stole Joe's thunder, so you can't promote anything.
Well, I forgot that we didn't do closing thoughts. I'll say this: the history thing and the thing in the beginning, just listing the court cases were, and the suicide one. I mean, they're all really good articles. I mean, I don't know how long it took you to go through that, but it was pretty great. I'll say that the history thing blew my mind because if you stop and think about it, it's true. But I never made the correlation between the two. To the fact that the Supreme Court says that, hey, the government doesn't have the right to take your guns, but the states can regulate your guns. That was interesting, which I know about states' rights in the Supreme Court, but to make that line and say, this is why, I think was interesting. And then I think the suicide thing was interesting as well, that this is a problem. And I think it really talks to the issue of mental health that everybody always brings up and doesn't want to politicize. But it is important, and I think it needs to be addressed. I know you've said it before, but thanks for talking about that on the pod about your depression. You mentioned it here and there, but to be honest, it's a big deal.
I'd like to be open about it because I want people to recognize that, the face of depression is someone who doesn't look depressed. I can't count the number of times I've discussed it with people where they're like, "Wait, what? You? But you're so functional." Exactly. Yeah.
You're so funny. You told a joke 10 minutes ago.
You don't know. You just don't know. And I think it's important that people recognize that anyone can deal with it. You don't know what's going on in their head. A lot of times we're putting on masks when we're out in the world because it's awkward and uncomfortable. And some people aren't, but a lot of people do. Yeah. Anyway, so, kind of closing thoughts, same scenario I brought up before, right? The purpose of the Second Amendment is to protect, to allow citizens to protect themselves from a government that becomes tyrannical. Mm-hmm. I do believe also there's a key part in personal self-defense. I'm a huge defender of the Second Amendment, but I am also, like the majority of Americans, a believer that we do need to have regulation in place, like background checks. I'm even a fan of gun training. Texas, one of the most pro-gun states in the country. I don't know if it's changed, but when I moved there in 2017, their laws to get a concealed carry permit, you actually had to pass a written class and exam, and
I heard they were gonna repeal some of those? Because we did the episode on Texas and I brought that up. I don't know how that went through. Actually,
some of that back. I'm not 100% sure because I don't live there anymore. But I will say that, like, if Texas is doing that, why is it a big deal for us to even do that on a national level? To like, yeah, okay, you can own a gun. You have to pass a background check. I'd even go so far as to say we might do a psych eval. The challenge with the psych eval is you could say it's bias, and so there are difficulties in doing that. And then not just a written test, but a physical test. Like, we actually have to make sure you can operate a gun, you can get around downrange on target.
I think just the waiting period is pretty important, because the fact that if somebody was going to commit something that's horrific, like in Uvalde, just to have the organization run the background check over several days, maybe that person has a moment of self-reflection, or just, hey, I don't want, it's too much. I can't wait 5 days. They stop, get the help, or just, for whatever reason, it had to happen on a Monday, but now with the waiting period, Wednesday doesn't work for them, whatever's going on. I think the waiting period is the number one thing. And I think the red flag laws, if, the studies that I've read say they do work, I think those need to be talking about. But again, it feels like, I understand that registered gun owners are going to states to talk to different states, but I wish there was a national conversation with registered gun owners to say, this is what we are okay with, and this is what we are not okay with. And even on the left, it's like, listen, this isn't going to go either way. We're not going to be able to find an impasse. So you have to come to the table and say, all right, let's talk. At least let's talk. This has to stop. We have to do mental health training, or we have to do something. So I'm not going to take away your gun. I don't want to take away your gun. I understand you're a law-abiding registered gun owner. What do we do? There needs to be good faith. I mean, that's part of negotiation. And, we've talked about this all the time with negotiation. There needs to be good faith on both sides. And I think that's just not happening, which is part of the problem.
In some pockets. In other pockets, it is, right? It depends on who you're talking to. So,
right.
And some states are doing it, but at a federal level, it is going to happen. The last article we didn't really go into was the NRA predicts Supreme Court will finally define what the Second Amendment really means.
Oh, crap. Oh, crap. That's going to be a thing.
What is it? NRA predicts Supreme Court will finally define Second Amendment. And they're saying that future case law coming from the Bruen decision is finally going to define what the Second Amendment actually means. We'll see if that actually happens. I think that's optimistic. So
the
we're
Bruen
past the
one,
closing arguments. We can keep running down the bunny trail.
Yeah, we're probably going
to. But I mean, ultimately, I am a believer in the Second Amendment. I think it is there for good reason. I think it serves good cause, but we do need to find a balance in society of where do we balance individual freedom and rights against overall public safety and even individual safety.
Yeah, because I know people that don't want to, like you said, you don't want a gun. I know other people that are like, I don't want it. And like me, I have one. I feel that I'm good. I don't need, some people are like, I want another pistol. I want I want a hunting rifle, whatever. Like, to me, that doesn't bother me, but I want to be in a position where I'm like, hey, I trust that person to have a rifle or a pistol, like me, I'm like, I'm good. I got the pistol. Like, I'm fine. Like, I don't need, to let everyone, I have a revolver, so it's really high tech. But I have gone with my wife gone shooting because I want her to feel comfortable with it. Anyway, we can go on and on. But so next month, I'm announcing right now because I've been debating what I was going to do. And Evan, we did the Second Amendment, so why don't we do the First Amendment? Why don't we talk about free speech? And I think that the news and everything that's coming out of the news and free speech, you and I have talked, again, we talk about doing pre-shows, but we're very busy. The thing with the pre-show, I think we just talked for a few moments, the idea that, do you want, I think you and I were talking about, you and I were saying, like, do you want someone to say something harmful? No, but you want to know that they have the right to say it. And two, you kind of want to know what's coming. Like, I don't like what, let's say Kanye, I don't like anything that he said, and it made me feel horrible, but it's almost like, okay, so Kanye is one of those people I just don't like anymore. You know what I mean? Like, I know what they're like. And so if people aren't allowed to speak their mind, anyway, we can get into that next month. But I want to talk about the First Amendment because it keeps coming up with, to a lesser extent, cancel culture. But like, what on what platform, what can you say, what can't? what is the role of big tech and all that? How does the government regulate that, and how have they regulated before? I want to talk about the First Amendment. So that's what we'll talk about next month. And I don't think we've ever talked about it. I would have to look at our episodes, but I don't think it's something we've ever talked about
topically. I don't think we've ever done it as an actual full episode.
In passing, but we haven't done like a whole episode on it. So have a good month, everybody, and we will see you again next month when we talk about the First Amendment. Thank you.